Hello, welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
David Kennedy
and Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today we are delighted. We're going to kick off our fourth season with Dr. Bob Macauley. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you for having me.
We are so excited to dive into this conversation and the recent book that has just come out that you've written. And so I'm going to just read quickly your bio and then we'll dive into that conversation. So Dr. Robert Macauley is one of only a few hundred pediatricians in the United States who is board certified in hospice and palliative medicine. He has been the Cambia Health Foundation Endowed Chair in Pediatric Palliative Care at Oregon Health and Science University since 2017. He lives with his wife, 4 kids, and 2 rescue dogs in Portland, Oregon. And you've just published a book called Because I Knew You, How Some Remarkable Sick Kids Healed a Doctor's Soul.
Thanks for having me on. And I have to confess, I'm kind of doing my own version of grieving because those 4 kids, 3 of them are now out of the house. So I still claim having them at home, but I miss them every day.
Well, Julie?
I'm right there with you, Bob. Just dropped one off yesterday.
Yeah, I feel your pain. And, I don't know whether to be happy they're having such a great time or just wondering, couldn't you miss us a little bit more? But I don't know, we'll work it out.
Off out of the nest they go. Well, Bob, I can tell you when I first picked up your book, I was a little intimidated by it because it has such great heft. And then I read it and I said, it deserves that much heft because it is a wonderful read. I was intimidated thinking that I was going to be sort of weighed down with the subject matter, and I felt nothing but sort of lifted up, oddly enough, in reading it, which is just wonderful. But to get the ball rolling, you are a man of many hats, and you're an ethicist. You're also a priest in the Episcopal Church, and you're a pediatric palliative care physician and author. And your book is so full of good stories. God, the journey for you to get to where you are right now is another good story. How did you get from ethicist, priest, palliative care physician to pediatric palliative care physician? What's that story?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's a little bit meandering. So when I was in college, I was debating about whether to go into medicine or into ordained ministry. And nobody told me that I didn't have to choose, so I assumed I had to choose. And so I decided to go to medical school. And before that, I did a degree in theology, thinking that was my only shot at studying theology. And then it was very fortuitous. I interviewed at a medical school where I ended up going, and my interviewer was late. So they handed me the course catalog. This is back in the ancient days where you didn't have smartphones and you could just, surf the web. And they told me, sit in the corner, read the course catalog. And I found myself looking at a little mention of the MD, MDiv combined program between the medical school and the divinity school, which I didn't know existed and which I was very fortunate to be able to take part in. So I was ordained in the Episcopal Church right when I graduated from medical school. And then for a little bit of time, I tried to do a bit of one and a bit of the other, which was not the best idea, especially with a growing family, since neither of those are really part-time jobs. And so I found my way to ethics, which I thought was where I would end up because it allowed me to do a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of medicine. But it's also very cerebral. It tends to be very analytical, which is not bad, but it wasn't really where my heart was. And as a pediatrician, I missed taking care of kids because most ethical dilemmas have to do with adults. So I started a pediatric palliative care team at the hospital where I was working as an ethicist because we didn't have one. And then I realized over time that was really where my heart was. And after getting tired of splitting time for many years, I was fortunate enough to find my way here to Oregon from my previous home in Vermont, where I just do pediatric palliative care. And I'm very happy to just do pediatric palliative care.
Were you pulled into this, or were you running toward it? What was sort of the energy that brought you from one place to another?
That's a great question. I think the pull probably depending on which perspective you take, was the fact that there were needs that were not being met at my previous hospital. Pediatrics is always a little bit behind the adult world. And so when you have a development in adult medicine, it takes pediatrics a little bit of time to catch up. So if palliative care really sort of established itself as a specialty in the adult world, probably in the 1990s, it took a little while longer in pediatrics. To give you a sense, I trained, my residency was 1995 to 1998. Not only did we not have a pediatric palliative care team, I'm quite confident I didn't hear the word palliative in 3 years of residency. Like, it was just not a thing that we talked about. So I think that there was a vacuum there. There was a gap. And then I think that the internal drive for me was feeling like I might have something to offer by virtue of palliative care going beyond just physical health, but also attending to the emotional and the spiritual aspect of things. And as I talk about in the book, my own childhood was such that I think I understand something about what it means to hurt as a child. And I really didn't want anyone else to feel that way.
I love that quote that you quoted from Richard Rohr that talks about pain that is not transformed is transmitted. And
yes,
you have certainly worked at the transformation piece of that pain for sure. If I could just follow that up a little bit about, palliative work, as we know, with adults is a challenge, always seems to be the challenge at, when do people get into that stream of medicine? How do they find their way into that? And you talk about that in your very first story with Nikki, I think it is, who had the Hunter syndrome, and you make the point there where your director, Dr. Williamson, wanted you to get a DNR because I think, as you said, he believed the focus should be more on keeping Nikki comfortable rather than alive. And you talk about the struggle of getting people to see palliative care earlier on. And I'm just wondering, if that's true for adults, which it is, it must be doubly difficult for parents to come to that point of hearing that word palliative care for their child.
It absolutely is. And I think that there's an understandable, and I'm not criticizing it, presumption towards maximal treatment in pediatrics. I often say that when an 80-year-old gets cancer, you have a conversation. When an 8-year-old gets cancer, you start chemo. Like, we're not having a conversation about this because kids shouldn't get sick and they definitely shouldn't die. So I don't criticize that. I think that that's reasonable. The question about how to layer in palliative care, especially with persistent and common misperceptions about what palliative care is, about giving up and only about end of life, can be very, very difficult. And I think that that's one of the things I try to help our adult learners when they come through our team. So our team has a lot of pediatricians who train with us. We also have adult palliative care fellows. And one of the things I say to them is, you have to really wait a long time before you try to pivot towards any discussion of redirection of care with pediatrics, because it is so unnatural. It goes against every bone in a parent's body to not do everything possible to try to help their child survive, no matter what the cost. And so if we try to pivot too quickly and say, we've had a bit of conversation now, what would you think about this? It thuds because it's so different from where the parents are at. And I think we need, in pediatrics, to sit with the injustice for much longer and name the injustice, because it's never right that a child dies, ever, but it happens. So how do we come to grips with that? And how do we gently open up avenues of conversation that are incredibly difficult to have?
Bob, could you maybe give an example, and you could pull one from one of the ones in the book if you'd like, just to how do we sit? What does that look like? What does that sound like? How do you sit with the injustice with the family before we can start that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I think that part of it is really sitting rather than just waiting for an opportunity to change the conversation, because I think people they know what's going on. Every time someone says these parents don't get it, I'm like, I think they actually get it. I think most people get it. It's just a question of how they're processing impossibly difficult information. So if a parent has potentially the accurate perception that a palliative care person is just sort of waiting for an open door to try to shift the conversation, that I think can feel manipulative, and that's not where they're at. And so I think we need to be honest with ourselves. Like it's wrong. Like the fact that I have a job in this field is wrong. Like it would be a much better world if I had to find another job. I would love that world, because that means that kids didn't get sick and die and need people who do, not just me, but all the other people who do the stuff that I do. And then I think we enter into it very gently. One of the things we talk a lot about, in at least the palliative care team that I work with, is what we call the 3 W's, which I think other people work with too, which is wish, wonder, and worry. So rather than saying to somebody, I think we should do something different, to just begin a very gentle exploration of, I wonder what it would look like if we focused more on comfort. And the advantage of that is I'm not forcing anything on anybody. And if they don't want to go there, they don't have to go there. And also, most people feel free to wonder about a lot of things. So we can begin to explore something and maybe allay some concerns, address some misperceptions, and then we give it time. So, the case that David mentioned earlier, my very first case, when I knew even less about what I was doing than I do now, when I was trying to sit with Nikki's mom in a period where it felt like he was approaching the end of his life, which turned out to be true, we told stories. She told me stories, and I listened about how he had defied expectations, about how he had he surprised people by what he was able to do, how much he meant to the people in his family, how he inspired them in so many ways. And that was important for her to share, and it was important for me to hear. And it was only when she was at a point where she could hear other things that we went there. But that wasn't at the beginning or in the middle. It was at the end. And I think that's totally fine. That's where she was at. And we got to where I think we needed to be. And we got there in the time that it took and legitimately should have taken to get there.
That story just reminds me of, you really, in this situation, you have two patients, really. You've got the young person who's dying, but the role that the family must play is so different than when it's an adult or an older person who's dying, right? So what's the role of the family? How does the family come into the work that you do?
Well, I'll answer it on 2 levels. One will be, I think, fairly non-contentious, and the other one might be a little more contentious. So the non-contentious is, we talk about family-centered care in pediatrics, because aside from situations where you have an older child, especially someone who is approaching the age of majority or has passed it, we talk about a triadic relationship. So instead of it being patient and medical team, it's patient-parent or parents and medical team. So you're working in that construct all the way through. It creates complexity because the decision-making model for adults is you try to figure out what that adult patient's values are and honor those. Especially for young children, they may not have developed a personal sense of value. Like an infant clearly has not and couldn't communicate it even if they had. So you're working with what the parents believe is in the child's best interests, which is their own value system. Not to say that that's not important, but it's not the patient's. So we try to work in that model. The potentially more contentious piece comes when you recognize that if a child is not going to survive, the parents are the ones who are going to have to live with that and live with the decisions that they made for the rest of their lives. And so it creates complexity when you're in a situation where you think to yourself, I don't think this is maybe, in my personal opinion, the best thing to do for this child. That maybe the child is undergoing too much suffering, but the parents are acting, and they don't usually articulate this explicitly, but you can kind of get a sense that they need to be able to wake up the next morning and think back and say, I tried everything. So if I can take us on a bit of a tangent, one of my favorite articles in the medical literature was written about 15 years ago now by Bob Trug, who is an intensivist and ethicist at Boston Children's Hospital. And the article title of it is pretty close to, "Is it wrong to perform futile CPR?" And he tells the story of a child, I want to say about 4 years old, who was clearly dying of cancer in the ICU, getting lots and lots of treatment, was never going to leave the hospital. And their team did a wonderful job of talking to the parents about potentially redirecting care towards comfort, potentially putting in a limitation of treatment order. And the parents said, "We just need to know we did everything." And it was causing great moral distress among the staff. And then one night, the patient went into cardiac arrest, and they started CPR and called the parents, and took the parents a little bit to get to the hospital because they were at home. And in the meantime, the team, to their credit, I think, did CPR and advanced cardiac life support in the best possible way. They didn't just go through the motions. But then they eventually realized they were never going to get the child back. So they called the code. They stopped the code before the parents got there. And they tried to sort of clean up the patient and put on a clean sheet so that when the parents walked in, that they were not more traumatized than they already were. And the author, Dr. Trug, said he was so nervous when the dad walked in because there were signs of attempted resuscitation. There were puncture marks for where they had to try to put in central lines in order to administer medications and things like that. And he will always remember what the father said. He lifted up the sheet, he saw the puncture marks, and he turned to the doctors and nurses and said, "Thank you so much. I can see how hard you tried." Mm-hmm. Now, this article provoked a lot of feedback. There were tons of letters to the editor, and they weren't all complimentary. I don't mean to say this is God's own truth and everybody should live this truth. A lot of people said, "This is terrible. You failed in your obligation because this child went through suffering." I'm not sure if the child suffered, because one might think reasonably that he was already gone and was not there to perceive the suffering. But Trug makes a statement which I think I agree with, which is to say, there comes a time when a child has reached so close to the end of their life, especially if they are not able to perceive suffering, that our focus begins to shift more to the parents. Not entirely on the parents, but more so. And that's a little bit of countercultural statement for the pediatric world, where we always talk about the child being the patient, but really is the family. And sometimes I think that balance shifts a little bit, especially at the end of a child's life.
I love that. And I think, just in terms of practical aspects, that's where DNRs, for instance, where it's so difficult to get a parent to sign a DNR for a child. Mm-hmm. And when hospice care, for instance, for adults demands a DNR before you qualify, let's say, it's just such a barrier to a parent to have to sign something like that.
It's also interesting in pediatrics, and I'm not sure if this is a pediatric adult distinction or a Canadian US distinction, but we will not infrequently send a child home from the hospital with a plan for hospice enrollment while that patient is still full code or has no limitation of treatment order in place. And sometimes people look at us like, well, that seems odd, like the whole notion of hospice to be full code. And one of the reasons that we sometimes do that is the hospice discussion in and of itself is so incredibly hard because of hospice, as they should. They don't make any bones about the fact that it's end of life care. And so parents, in order to conceive of hospice, have to admit to themselves that their child is not going to survive. In my experience, if I can walk with a family, especially since most of my work is in the hospital, if I can walk with a family to the point where they say, yes, we think hospice is the right way to go, for me to say, oh, and now can we talk about a limitation of treatment order, feels like I'm just piling on at that point. Also, in the United States, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, which some people call Obamacare, kids under the age of 21 can be on hospice and still receive all the other treatments that they were already getting. So it doesn't require them to stop that. And so sometimes hospice is kind of like, well, let's try that and see how it goes. They don't know what they're getting. I know what they're getting. And so I think if I take a step back and say, why don't you meet the folks from hospice? See if you trust them. See what it's like to be home. I know you're telling me that you want to come back to the hospital, but why don't you see what it feels like once you're back home and you get this incredible care? And then hospice can have that conversation after having built that relationship to give the family the confidence that if my child dies at home, he will be or she will be comfortable. Then that's a conversation I can't have with them because they haven't learned what hospice is and learned how much they can trust them. So there's sort of that middle ground sometimes we try to explore in pediatrics.
And there are certainly some differences in the hospice from U.S. to Canada in the terms of there's no cost, et cetera, and the availability is different. But it's still that basic issue of it's just so hard as to recognize and to see that piece come to a place where parents can allow that to happen. Now, and it does. I mean, some of your stories where they finally, but that's usually right at the very end when that it's like, okay, now we see that. Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is the fact that in pediatrics, we're just not as used to patients not surviving. Death is much less common, thankfully, in pediatrics. And in at least the US data is that less than 0.5% of hospice patients in the United States are under the age of 21. So 99.5% are going to be adults. So that creates a situation where a lot of pediatricians and pediatric subspecialists, it's not something that they're very familiar with. And so they don't necessarily have the perspective about what hospice can do and the right time to get hospice involved.
Can you tell us a little bit about your soul callus?
Yeah, so that's a term that I use.
Where it's at these days?
So in the book, I talk about my own history, and I talk about the fact that I was abused as a child, and what the phrase that I use there is that I developed soul calluses. And what I mean by that is, a callus like on the bottom of your foot comes from, babies don't have calluses on their feet because they are fresh and they don't have any abrasions or anything like that. It's a perpetual degree of injury, you will develop a callus as a self-protective mechanism. And it does great for self-protection. It also decreases feeling. The sole of your foot, if you step on something, sometimes it doesn't hurt too much because you've developed those calluses. For me, that's what I developed. And I think that when I first started in pediatric palliative care, I didn't necessarily look at them as something to be cultivated, but I did recognize that they were a bit of an asset in highly emotionally charged situations. So that it wasn't like I didn't feel things, but I could sort of tuck things away in the right way at the right time in order to bring them out when the crisis had passed. And then the kids that I treated, including many of the ones that I talk about in the book, began to pierce those calluses, that they were able to break through those walls, which was really wonderful in some ways and really, really hard in others. So there were situations where early in my career, I think I would have been able to keep my stuff together in real time. And then I ceased to be quite as good at that. Now people kind of make fun of me, like I'll cry at the drop of a hat these days. So I think my soul calluses are not doing very good, which for me is actually really good. And in large part to the impact that these kids and their families have had on my life. And in a way, like this is a book about healing, but I think a whole lot of it is my own. And it kind of finally came to me. The last chapter I talk about a patient who died sort of expectedly. Like we knew she was going to die. We just didn't know that she was going to die right when she did. And it took many of us by surprise. And I knew I probably would never see her parents again because they lived pretty far away. And I wrote them a note the next day, which I don't always, talking about what their family had meant to me and what their daughter had taught me. And in a way, it was condolence. And in a way, it was sort of a thank you note for saying thank you for letting me play a part in your life and welcoming me into this sacred moment. And as I was writing that chapter, I kind of realized like the whole book is like on one level, not entirely, but on one level, like one big thank you note to about 18 kids who restored my faith in humanity. Like, I know that sounds really big, but I think it's actually really true. For someone like me who experienced things early in life that no one should do to somebody else, I found my way to a place where people did things that I didn't think human beings could in terms of bravery and generosity and making impossibly hard and heartbreaking decisions. And that is a blessing to me.
I think any of us that have worked in palliative care can say yes to your description of it being a very sacred space. And I think that's something that touches us. I must say I found a great connection with Grace and the story of Grace, and partly because I volunteered for a number of years at a neuroblastoma family camp. And in fact, in one of our podcasts, we interviewed the Burrell family, who their son James died of neuroblastoma, and the result, they started a James Fund and have raised over $5 million for research. And wow. Dr. David Kaplan, I don't know if you know him, he started a lab at Sick Kids in Toronto specifically for neuroblastoma. And it's just been an amazing journey with him. I loved what you said about Grace at the end of her life. You reflected and said, I'm not sure if she realized how much she taught me. My life has always been dictated by shoulds, and children should be quiet and obedient. But Grace has long ago stopped caring about what should or shouldn't happen. She was too busy living her life, and then Mary Oliver's quote, in a wild and precious life. Mm-hmm. And these kids have taught us a great deal of things, taught you things that have actually changed your life dramatically.
They absolutely have. And I think that I just got back we go back to Vermont, where we used to live, for a couple of weeks every summer. And this visit was very busy for us because I had a chance to get together with about 7 or 8 of the families in the book they knew about the book, obviously, because we had discussed at great length what their chapter was going to look like. When they said it was okay for me to try to write it. And then I sent them the chapter and we debriefed it and corrected whatever I got wrong. So they knew it was coming out, and some of them I'd already sent a copy to, and other ones I just hand delivered it. But I think one of the things I was hoping for, which I think I heard from many of them, was that they realized how much the medical folks who had helped take care of their kids, how much that meant to them, that how much the medical folks' work meant to the families. And several of them said, until we read your book, we didn't realize that we gave you something too. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be perfectly balanced. Like, I think healthcare is largely and sort of an asymmetric relationship. Like, speaking as a physician, I ask people a lot of questions about themselves. I get to know them really well. And sometimes they don't really know much at all about me, nor necessarily should they. It's not a friendship. It's not perfectly equivalent. But at the same time, when you walk down such a sacred path together, it means something to know that some guy wasn't just doing their job. You know, they weren't punching a clock and going home at the end of the day and forgetting about your kid. Like, some of these patients, they died over a decade ago, and we're still talking about them. And now this book is out there, and people pick up this book and they read about that very, very special kid. And I hope that means something to the parents. They told me that it did, and I'm not surprised, because they and their children touched a lot of lives. And it's kind of nice when you touch someone's life if they let you know that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I found myself thinking about the word legacy as I was reading some of these stories, and I wanted to ask you that question about how the parents' willingness to allow you to share that part of their child's story is a way to ensure some legacy, like that the world, that those of us who read this book also now get to be touched by them, also get to have some sense of who they were and what they meant in the world. And that was shining through for me as I read it.
Yes, and example of that, I think I mentioned near in the afterword that I shared with person who said it when I was back in Vermont just last month. So Colin was one of my favorite patients. He died at 19 of cystic fibrosis, and I had worked with him and his family for some years before he died. And I very much remember I had this conversation. So when I thought about writing this book, I reached out to the parents of the kids I was thinking about and said, would it be okay if I tried to write? And they said yes, and And I said to all of them, look, at any point, right up until the day before this thing gets published, if it starts to feel wrong for you for whatever reason, you just tell me and I'll take that chapter out. Like, no questions asked, because first rule of medicine, right? First, do no harm. And Colin's mother, Deb, said something to me that I will never forget. And she said, look, the worst thing that could ever happen to me happened to me. My son died. The second worst thing that could happen to me is that the world forgets him. And if your book makes that less likely, then it has to be a good thing. And I remember when she said that to me, around this very, very emotionally resonant Zoom call with her and her husband and me when I was writing that chapter, I remember thinking two things. One is, that is so beautifully put. And the second thing was, well, I guess there's no giving up on this project. Like, like, first of all, I'm a really stubborn person. I don't think I would have given up, most likely, despite all the rejections that happened once I finally got the manuscript done. But when she said that, I'm like, well, what if, even if I was tempted to give up, that is not happening because the stakes are too high.
And, I mean, we often say, all of us in our work, but I will say to somebody, nobody deserves to be remembered only by how they died. It's important, but that's not it. And that's what I loved about your book. You helped us see these people, these kids, not just how they died, but who they were, who they are, and the sense of life. And I think that's the value that we do in legacy. Is it's not just that how a person died, it happened, it's true, but that's not the story that we choose to be the focal point of who they are. They deserve more than just that moniker on their file. These are human beings, lovely people, incredibly gifted, and your stories help us see them as human beings. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that. I totally agree with what you said. And I think that it applies to all the kids. Colin was 19 when he died. He did a lot of living in 19 years. And then some of the other patients only survived sometimes for months or sometimes hours. And they still made a big impact. And it wasn't just about their dying. It was about their living and the impact they made.
And it's somehow about how you tell the story. I don't know how many times I had to reach for the Kleenex when I was reading this, because I'm reading this story and it's well written, and then you come to the part, and you did it here a few minutes ago, telling the story of that little guy in ICU, and the parent coming in and looking under the sheet and saying, I thank you because I see you tried everything, or you did everything you could, I forget what the line was. I mean, that just, the humanization, I think, and that really does, it connected on a level that was incredibly, I think, soul-based. And every one of those kids at a certain point at a certain time in their story got through, through the defenses, got through the through the armor that we sometimes carry around with us, and it really just then connected us as human beings, person to person, soul to soul. And I was struck as I went through my notes, all the things I wrote down about powerlessness, and I wrote down that quote that said, "Don't just do something, stand there." And when you were talking to, I think it was Emerson's parents, and you told them that they were given the options of some interventions that they weren't comfortable with, and you said basically actually preventing those things is doing something. And then for some reason I have here, can you speak to us about the powerlessness and the power of powerlessness?
Wow. Yeah. I think that the primary instinctual sense that most parents have with regard to their children, in addition to like wanting their children to thrive and flourish and all this kind of stuff, is protection. Right? Like that's sort of like the number one rule is like you protect your child at all costs. And regardless of how their life is, you want them to live until tomorrow and many other tomorrows. And so the thought of there's this thing that you would give your life for, you would trade places with your child in a heartbeat if you could, but you can't. And then you have to face the fact that no matter how hard you fight and how much you do, your child will not survive, is unspeakably hard. And I don't say that from personal experience. I have not experienced that in my own life, but I have walked alongside. And so I say that not from personal experience, but as a witness to what people have shared with me and what I have seen. I'm grappling with the power of powerlessness. And I'm not sure if I'm able right this second to go that far. Maybe I will at some point. I think it's more about becoming at peace to some degree with what one can do and what can't do, and then reframing what protection means. So there is protection from things that threaten your child's life. And then there are protection from things that cause suffering that is not necessary in any way, shape, or form. And so I think that there's a way of reframing it to say that maybe you're not as powerless as you think, because there are things you can exert control over. And while we're talking about Emerson, I feel like I need to share this. So I got together with her family when I was back in Vermont. She has a younger sister now who's about 6 years old. And so we got together, me and her parents and her 6-year-old younger sister. And Emerson died in infancy many, many years ago. And I didn't know how much to talk about Emerson. Like I didn't know how much her 6-year-old sister knew about her. I'm sure she knew something, but I didn't know if it would be kind of not understandable. I didn't know if it would evoke sadness or what to do, and I wanted to tread gently there. And her parents, we were having dinner together. Her parents said, to her sister Margot, said, Margot, this is one of Emerson's doctors. And so I was like, okay, we're talking about it, which I thought was great. And then Margot sort of literally like shifted a little bit over to her in her seat and looked down and said, "Oh, we're talking about you, Emerson." and I said,
I love it.
And I looked, and then her parents were like, yeah, she just, it's as if she's right next to her every moment of her life.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think there are ways we carry those things forward. I just felt like that needed to be shared.
What a beautiful story. I have a question for you personally in terms of how do you, or which has had the more impact? I'm struggling a bit on how to phrase this, but which has impacted which the most? Has your faith impacted your work as a palliative pediatric physician, or has your work in pediatric palliative impacted your faith? How would you see that interplay?
Yeah, I don't know if I can quantify, because it works both ways. I think that the book talks a lot about the role of my work has impacted my faith and the faith struggles that I have had. And I think leading to what I'd like to think is a more mature understanding of myself and my place in the world and what is beyond me. But I think that faith for me is multifaceted as to how it impacts the work. Specifically, it's not about propositional belief. It's not like I come to my work as a palliative care doctor and that the fact that I believe X, Y, or Z about God or theology or something like that. It's not really that. It is the experience I had in a purely pastoral capacity that I think impacts my palliative work, which is to say that physicians are fix-it people. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. Certain specialties really need to be fix-it people. Like I fractured my foot last year, and when I went to see the orthopedic surgeon, he was really nice. And he said, "I'm sorry that you broke your foot. That must be hard." And I'm like, "Yes. And can you fix it, please?" Like I wasn't looking for, empathy, like, because I'm like, dude, fix my foot. I want to be able to walk again. And he did great. So like, that's a great thing. But that gets us into trouble when there are things we can't fix. And so when I was a parish priest, there were people I knew and was in relationship with purely as a priest, not as a physician. And there was a ton of stuff I couldn't fix. And so I think that I'm probably more comfortable, not entirely, but more comfortable with not fixing things than the average doc, which is probably a good thing given the specialty I chose. Like one of my mentors was an adult hospice doc, and she would often say that the mortality rate among her patients was 100%. So how did she come to grips with that? And she did a wonderful job coming to grips with it and understanding that. So I think that for me, at least, I still hope for things. I still hope for fixing. I often say to families, the sweetest thing anyone can ever say to me is, "I don't need you anymore." And I love that. But when we can't fix things, I think I'm probably more at peace with that by virtue of my pastoral background.
Would you like to speak to the point in your book? I think it's a 200 odd pages in, where you tackle one of the questions around why, if there is a God, does God allow children to suffer and die?
Well, I kind of felt like that was like the $1 million question that somebody picks up the book and they're like, okay, here's this guy. He's a pediatric palliative care doc. He's a priest. Heck, he even wrote his master's thesis on the problem of evil. Like, it's going to have to deal with this at some point. So it really forced me to grapple with that more, not just about the patients I was treating who did not survive, but also the very unexpected and sudden death of my best friend and what that meant for he was the godfather to my kids. I sort of look at his 3 kids as 3 more of my own, and trying to support them through an impossibly difficult situation for someone who dies unexpectedly at 54. And so I don't know if I came up with answers. In a way, if I were to summarize it, it is, I don't have any answers, but I'm still talking about it. I'm still having a conversation, not only with y'all today, but internally and with others. And I think I quote Elie Wiesel in the book that the opposite of love is not hatred, it's apathy or indifference. And so I'm not indifferent. I'm not uncurious. I think that the fact that I'm still searching, still grappling, means that there's something there, or at least I hope that there is something there. And I think it has changed my theological views a lot. I was raised in sort of an evangelical, well, definitely an evangelical background. And I think that what I considered to be sort of facing head on the notion of a God who has the power to do things that are not being done and what that means, I think I'm less focused on how to philosophically justify it and more drawn to parts of the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible about how God feels alongside with us. Jürgen Moltmann has a wonderful book called The Crucified God, and talks about suffering and knowing what it means to suffer. Now, does that go all the way? Does that go as far as I wish it did? Absolutely not. But it is certainly something I can engage with more than a God who is removed from the world and people respond to in what I consider to be platitudinous ways, like, all things work together for good for those who love God. Like, granted, that is a verse from the Bible. I grant that, but I can't imagine ever saying that to a bereaved parent. I find that to be scant comfort. And I think it's more honest to wrestle with our anger towards God through that. So I'll give away something that is, but it's sort of a funny aside. So that part, Julie, around that part in the book, I lead up to the fact, like, okay, reader, you've been waiting for it. Here it comes. This is my answer. And what follows are 2 blank pages.
Yeah. Loved it.
I love that.
Yeah.
And after that, then I kind of say, so I don't have an answer, but this is what I'm thinking. The interesting thing is, it turns out, in my modest expectations of book sales, first of all, it was a really clever ploy on my part to put the 2 blank pages in there that I never anticipated, because multiple people had told me that they bought the book, saw the 2 blank pages, figured it was a typo, so they bought another copy, figuring that that was just a one-off. So I managed to sell twice as many books to those people by virtue of that. But I've had about a half a dozen people, just in very, very generous of spirit, either text me or email me saying, like, I think your book is so great. Congratulations. I'm so looking forward to going. But I have some bad news to tell you. Like, there's been a typo right in the center. You need to talk to your publisher. And to which I'm like, well, maybe just go back and look at what happens right before the blank pages and right after. And then they were like, oh, now I totally get it.
Yeah.
The questioning and the wondering keeps things alive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let you know you're still engaged in the conversation.
Right? Yes.
I love the way, too, you use that question right from the beginning of your book, and it's right at the end, that, that question that Dave asks you, why palliative care? And I love the way you progressively add to that. And at the very end, you say, if I would answer him now, if I had another chance, it would be, were it not for this work, I wouldn't know how brave and honest and wise and generous human beings can be. And I think we, the 3 of us, have talked, and the palliative team that we work with over the years have recognized that you can't do this work without our humanity leading the way. And the idea that whether you're a palliative physician or you're the caretaker in the residence, that we all approach this work in our humanity first, and that's what brings the connections that we need to this incredible time of life. And seeing as part of living. I think that's the other, it's always funny to me when people say, oh, they're dying. I say, well, when do you say they're dying? And what does that mean? Does that mean they've stopped living? And of course not. And I love the way you, and in a number of cases, including Colin, going outside of the box, as you talk about, and pushing the boundaries to out of the medical model of what they could do or shouldn't do, and finding ways to engage in life and human activity. And I think that's the wonderful joy of working in this work.
Couldn't agree more. I think that people look at pediatric palliative care in particular. They, like, as I say in the book, I don't tell people that I meet just randomly what I do for a living. I don't go into detail. Like, I say I'm a pediatrician, and they say that's nice, and they probably think of, mostly healthy babies and healthy kids, which is great. Because I learned early on that if I told them what I really do, then that leads them down a path that they oftentimes don't want to go down or are not ready for. Some of it based on misperceptions or faulty conclusions, because a lot of them think, like, this must be unbearably sad and everybody dies. And granted, there is death, but and there is sadness, but it's not unbearable, and it's not uncompensated by what you were saying, David, about how our lives are similarly touched by others. Even to the point where I wrote an article a few years ago that has a bit of an odd title, and it's called "The Selfishness of Pediatric Palliative Care." And when I tell people that, they're like, that's weird. And I said, well, it's not. I'd like to think I don't do this just for my own well-being. Like, I didn't go into this work because I was, like, looking to be restored in terms of my understanding of human nature. It just happened along the way. And there is something to be said for what we get out of this, because like if you go to work every day and you're like, oh, this is awful, my heart's going to be broken, but I really should do this because it's a noble thing to do. I don't think you're probably going to do the greatest job in the world, because I think people will pick up on that. And I don't mean to say it should all be about us, but there needs to be a balance. And I think that kind of circling back to what we were saying earlier, that's one of the most hopefully meaningful things for the families in this book, which is to say that they know how much they meant to me and also to a lot of other people, that their children, their lives were touched by that kid.
So on that note, I'm wondering, because we keep referencing in the book to the stories and the families and these kids, as we begin to wrap up today, would you share one with us? Would you kind of tell one of the stories in more detail so that our listeners today can get to know one of these kids and families?
Sure. So we mentioned Grace earlier. I often think about her. So Grace was about 15, started working with her. She had neuroblastoma, and she had already outlived the life expectancy. Blastoma, and her oncology team did an amazing job of continuing to find new treatments until it got to the point, summer before her senior year of high school, that they said, look, there's nothing more we can do for your cancer. And it became clear that she was going to die, and not too far off. And a lot of her dreams were not going to come true. One of her great dreams was to go to Europe with her class for a class trip, and her pain was so severe that it just was not possible to imagine her traveling that far from home with mobility issues and things like that. And so the other dream that she harbored was, she was a wonderful actress. I had seen some of her performances in high school. She really wanted to see Broadway. And I didn't know how to pull that off. It's only about a 5-hour drive from Vermont to New York, but even just jostling around in a car for 5 hours was going to be too much with all of her metastases. And then a bunch of other people showed up on the scene. A wonderful nursing student, now a nurse practitioner, was a pilot. She had friends who were pilots. They talked to their boss. A local corporation loaned us their corporate jet for the weekend, flew Grace and her mom and this nurse and me down to New York. And this nurse also reached out, somehow got in touch with Buddy Valastro, the Cake Boss, and we went to the set of the Cake Boss, which Grace loved watching. And then Buddy took her aside, gave her all kinds of swag, and I'm a big fan of Buddy Valastro. He gave her his business card with his private phone number and said, you call me anytime. And, some people do that just for performative reasons, and I had no doubt that it was just real from him, that he just was reaching out as a person. And then she went to see Wicked on Broadway, got a backstage tour, and the next day she was getting pretty tired and was in a lot of pain, and we were having to medicate that. And still managed to take a carriage ride through Central Park. And then we flew back. And there were times during that weekend that I kind of wondered what I was doing there, because we had like 2 medicines with us that the nurse was plenty able to manage on her own. So I wasn't prescribing anything. And there were times when I just thought to myself, I was the muscle, because when Grace needed to be transferred from her wheelchair into a cab or something like that, then I was the guy and I could do that. And I remember going back to, I think it was Red's question about soul calluses at the beginning. We got back to Vermont. She was in a lot of pain. I was wheeling her very slowly across the tarmac to her mom's car. And we'd always worked out how to get her into various cabs. And I'm like, well, I don't have to figure this one out because she gets in her mom's car, every day. So I just said, how do you get in your car? So I can make sure to do it the best way. And I always remember she looked up at me and she said, usually you carry me. So if there was sort of the end of the soul calluses, that was the moment. Because my old habits of keeping the tears at bay until I got to a safe place ceased to exist at that moment. And then she went home for a few hours, got in a terrible pain crisis, came back to the hospital, and she died the next day. And the thing that I took away from that was that a lot of people at the end of their life kind of fade away. And it's not criticism of them, because disease is a terrible thing and people have a lot going on. So it's not like she was better than other people, but she managed to live right up until the very end in her fullest way. And I will always be inspired by that, by her spirit, of her not taking no for an answer, of saying this is what I want, and being right there with people, even when they didn't do what she wanted them to do, if she felt like their heart was in the right place. So I think about her a lot. That was 13 years ago.
Well, thank you. This has been such just a wonderful gift. And I know we could probably talk for hours. And you've been so gracious to give us your time. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk on such a deep level with y'all. Appreciate the work that you do. And by way of feedback, I am amazed for the three of you. You just have this rhythm between the three of you and carrying on these conversations in such a natural and open way that I think that's amazing.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. We do get along well. So Julie kind of keeps us in the track.
Yeah. But that is, I think, one of the goals of what we try to do is have a real conversation. And just see where it goes and follow that flow. I'm glad to hear it works.
I think it works very, very well.
Bob, in closing, is there anything we haven't talked about or anything that feels important to say before we finish?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of ground. I agree. We could spend a lot more time covering other really good ground. I think that I would just reiterate what I said earlier, which is what a lot of the book is about, which is, will reading this book bring tears to people's eyes? I think inevitably, yes. Mm-hmm. Or should these kids have lived, the ones who died, should they have lived a heck of a lot longer than they did? Absolutely, yes. At the same time, this is not a doom and gloom book. My hope is that people will come away with a sense of admiration and respect for what these kids and their families have gone through, and be inspired to take some of those lessons to heart and carry those kids' legacies forward in terms of what they have taught me, and hopefully through me and the words on the page that other people can learn about their lives.
Certainly felt that.
Well, as a thankful reader, goal achieved.
Goal achieved.
Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it, dude.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is by Sean Heichert, and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.